We know that RSAC 2026 is going to be an AI heavy show. And while we're going to hear the AI will change everything narrative, our premise is that security leaders are being asked to operationalize AI in an environment where complexity is rising faster than control. Organizations are still struggling to consolidate the sprawl of tools in their security stacks and at the same time apply zero trust principles. To avoid AI becoming yet another layer, organizations must tie AI to clear outcomes and integrate intelligence into operating processes. ETR survey data captures the challenge. At least 90% of organizations say they're leveraging AI somewhere in their security stack, but 75% are applying AI to less than 10% of their security portfolio. And that gap quantifies the degree to which AI is present, but not yet scaled. Most deployments are narrow or tactical and constrained by the same blockers: reliable data access, integration across tools, governance, and trust. The AI SOC conversation will also dominate RSAC with increasingly automated triage, investigation, things like isolation and patching, et cetera, but agents will succeed or fail on foundations like telemetry, quality, identity controls, and exposure management hygiene, and of course, recoverability. As Jon Oltsik wrote in his RSAC preview, the agenda for RSA 2026 should be approached with curiosity and optimism, but also suspicion and of course, a plan. The conference is going to be full of platform claims across AI SOC, exposure management, identity, cyber resilience, but the practical question for CISOs is where AI reduces time to detect, time to respond, and operational friction without increasing risk, and where it simply adds another tool that the team can't integrate, govern, or measure. That should be avoided. In this week's Breaking Analysis, we collaborate with Jon Oltsik to prepare you for RSAC 2026 and highlight 5 top trends that he believes CISOs should monitor at this year's conference. Welcome, Jon Oltsik. Thanks for coming on.
Great to be here, Dave. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you bet. All right, let's start by exploring something that you highlighted in your preview piece in CSO, and that is the irony between the hype around AI agents juxtaposed to this year's conference theme, which is the power of community. So Jon, what does this tell us? On the one hand, humans in the security industry have become much more collaborative than they were, say, 10 or 15 years ago. Even competitors are sharing more threat intelligence, but now we have this entirely new dimension of machine-based agents acting on behalf of humans. What do you make of this ironic theme, as you called it, in the context of the age of agents?
Well, the irony is a bit snarky on my part, Dave. The truth is that, and it really speaks to your introduction, is agents are an adjunct to what we do as people. Sometimes they'll replace people, sometimes they'll augment people, but they're part of the community. And that's the way I think you should look at it, is the community, the power of collaboration, the power of community is there. It always has been there with the cybersecurity professional community, but now we're adding a tool, or an agent in this case, that can extend what we do, maybe enhance what we do, supplement what we do. And so that's what we have to think about in balancing AI and community is, how can AI help us as a community, help us as individuals? And if we do that, then the irony kind of goes away.
All right, well, let's go through your 5 big ones. And there are, of course, more than 5. RSA is such a huge, observation space across a really giant industry. But let's start with one of the potentially loudest conversations that we're going to hear at RSAC this year, which is the AI SOC. So, Jon, the vendor marketing, we're moving past co-pilots that help analysts toward, emphasizing, or at least exploring, what's possible in the SOC. But then now they're starting to really emphasize that agents can take on real SOC work, like doing things like triage and investigation, maybe do some containment, and even remediation. So isolating hosts, initiating patch workflows. These are the things that they're talking about. But my question to you is, what is real? So the direction is obviously compelling. We all see that and say, okay, this is great, but you got to worry about hallucinations, People talk about black box AI. You've got to have the scaffolding necessary to do the observation, understand what agents are doing, have the provenance and the lineage to figure out who did what, when, where. So I want to get your take on what's real versus what's marketing right now. Where do you see the AI SOC agents actually working today? What are the sort of requirements for balancing the promise of the AI fully automated SOC with the risks? Are there vendors or approaches that you're impressed by so far? Take it from there, please.
I think it's early in the game, and I'm very impressed with some of the innovation that's going on. If you look at the startups, what they've done, to their credit for the most part, is that they have picked an area of security operations and focused on that. So things like alert triage. There are thousands and thousands of alerts. Back when I was an analyst at ESG, I think we saw that organizations maybe could triage or treat 15 to 20% of those alerts if they were good. And now we have the tools that may be able to triage more of those alerts. We get closer to like 90, 95%. So all of that is really good. Now, the security community is very cautious by nature. That I think it was the day I started in cybersecurity, we were having the debate of IPS versus IDS, and security people said, no, we can't have IPS, we can't take actions, we have to be in the loop. So the human in the loop is still important. What I'm advising people to do is do a real kind of assessment of where automation will help you, where your processes are inefficient, where you are bottlenecked by the amount of data. And that's where you should focus your attention on the AI SOC. There are some innovative startups. I think all the big vendors are also doing their part, adding that on. There's the question of, is it a bolt-on or does it have to be AI native? I think to some extent it will be both. So there's a lot going on there, Dave. I'm not sure if you want to dig into any one of those.
Well, I was looking at some data recently, and it seems like there's still some concern, as you point out, that the human's got to be in the loop. You know, at the same time, and I don't know if this is related, there seems to be a trend toward, and you might have referenced this in your post later on, it might have made your honorable mention, I can't remember, but the whole MSSP trend to outsource at least portions of your SOC, and even large companies are doing that as complementary. I would imagine that from a business model standpoint, those MSSPs are going to be some of the most aggressive in terms of, implementing, the AI fully automated or close to it, AI SOC. Any thoughts on that?
You're absolutely right. So the MSSP business is a very thin margin business. In the past, to scale, you had to hire and train people. That doesn't scale, and especially when everyone else is trying to hire and train those exact people. So I expect a lot of innovation, a lot of implementation of AI and process automation in the big MSSPs, the Arctic Wolves, the Expels, the Level Blues of the world. And I'm really interested to hear what they're saying, because I think that is an innovative path that most people are ignoring. But if the MSSPs get this down faster, that's only going to grow their market and increase their margins.
Yeah, I don't know if you know this. So Nick Schneider's coming on he's the CEO of Arctic Wolf. He's coming on our CEO series. So definitely want to probe that with him.
You should.
Yeah, all right, good. Thank you for that. Let's move on to another trend that you highlighted. That's the concept of CTEM, continuous threat exposure management. I believe Gartner introduced that. They're like the world champion of cybersecurity acronyms, but the idea is that that snapshot scans of your exposure or even looking for holes in your software are inadequate, especially as the world moves at machine speeds. So the question then becomes, how do organizations get a handle on all their assets so they can have a much clearer picture of the threats? And it would seem that CTEM, works if the asset inventory is sort of accurate and credible. It's got to be complete. And as you pointed out, the associated data has to be of high fidelity. So you suggested in your preview that we're going to see a lot of vendors pushing CTEM. Help us separate the signal from the noise. What does good CTEM look like in practice? What are the common gotchas? How can organizations make CTEM a fundamental capability versus, adding on yet another tool?
It all starts with good data. And so you have to start by looking at your data. Is it accessible? Is it available? Is it in a format that can be used effectively? Once you have that data, you have to understand the context of that data. So for instance, which are my critical assets? What are the critical paths to those critical assets? And then you start to look at things like who has access to them. Are they configured correctly? Are we using multi-factor authentication to get into those systems? So there's a lot of upfront work, and that's often ignored in terms of the technology itself. I think there's a lot of really good innovation in this space, but it has to be customized for each industry. It has to be customized for each use case, for each organization. And that's the challenge here. So you have to work with a vendor who understands that and can help you along the way. If you do that, then yes, you can get to things like higher confidence in your risk scoring as to which systems are vulnerable and which are exposed, which are two different things. You can get into predictive analysis based on what the bad guys are doing, what they've exploited in the past. We might have a likely path to what they'll exploit in the future. And then we can work better with IT operations to remediate those vulnerabilities. So we're not handing them a list of 1,000 vulnerabilities that we ask for immediate patching. We're giving them priorities that align with the business criticality of systems.
I want to ask you about the data and kind of getting your data house in order. And I want to share some research that I've done and see if it applies to the world of cybersecurity. So speaking to companies like JPMC, Walmart, Amazon, not Amazon Web Services, but Amazon, retail, Capital One, Dell is another one that I've tested this on. There was a narrative that you should get your data house in order before you quote unquote, waste your money on AI. And what I found in speaking to these companies is they actually said, we thought that as well initially, but what we found was getting your data infrastructure in order, in their cases, database and having, vector search capabilities and RAG, inherent to the data platform, things like that were important. And once you had that you're better off getting on the AI curve and letting AI help shape and cleanse the data. And I'm wondering if that applies in cybersecurity, or do you see it differently?
No, I think it absolutely applies. We've been on this path for data security for years. So first you have to discover your data, then you have to classify your data, then you put the right controls in place. The fact is there's way too much data, and the data is growing so quickly that AI will be a force multiplier for us to do those things. So you have to do both, but clearly just waiting until you get things perfect on the data, just the state of the data and the data clarity, the data security, it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, clearly. I mean, things like discovery and classify, those are perfect for AI. And it's funny, a number of those firms, in fact, most of them, if not all of them, said, most of our data is still messy. It's the data that we need for the task at hand that matters the most. And, over time, it'll get better and better, or maybe not. Maybe the data will grow so much, but where they need data fidelity, they'll use the AI to get there. All right, let's talk about Christophe Bertrand, our friend Christophe, his favorite topic, cyber resilience, because this is one of those terms that the industry loves to market, but I want to try to work with you to make it meaningful. So the NIST definition that you referenced in your post, we're kind of showing here, and I should apologize to the audience for these AI graphics. I'm terrible at graphics, but AI gets kind of busy, but so be it. But what you shared was quite useful. That NIST definition is comprehensive, but kind of operationalizing resilience, you got to have careful planning. It doesn't happen overnight. Nonetheless, this idea of anticipate, withstand, recover, and adapt, it's a nice framework that involves, threat intelligence, exposure management, detection, incident response, and of course, backup and recovery. And you've got all the processes associated with that. The point is that cyber resilience, we often say, is an outcome. So you don't buy it off the shelf. And so, Jon, put some practical advice around this. When you hear cyber resilience in 2026, what's the sort of North Star that firms should be aiming for? Where should they start? How do they measure success? Are there red flags in terms of vendor claims that attendees should be wary of at RSAC?
You just mentioned the red flag, and that is any vendor that says we are in the cyber resilience business or we're a cyber resilience tool. They may be part of the process or part of the whole framework, but you do have to have an eye for caution there. I think it starts with the business. It starts with what systems you want to protect, what business processes you want to protect. In healthcare, for instance, they talk about clinical resilience. So that doesn't mean hospital resilience. It means like treating patients. It means the systems to treat patients. We need those. And if we have to take people in using paper and pencil, that's not going to stop us from treating them. We need to have the ability to treat them. So you start with what business processes you want to protect, but then you go through that: anticipate, withstand, recover, that whole and there's a fourth one I can't remember, but you go through each of those, because like anticipating means understanding the threat intelligence. Who's attacking us? How are they attacking us? Maybe applying the MITRE ATT&CK framework. It means detection engineering. It means tuning your controls. Withstand means things like network segmentation. So if a system's compromised over here, it may not be able to get to my crown jewels over there. It means the ability to detect and respond quickly. And then recovery is the things that Christoph has focused on for years, and that's like immutable backups. Can I get back online very quickly? So cyber resilience, as to the NIST definition, is not a single thing. It's a multitude of things that starts with what you want to protect and what you want to remain resilient. And one other example is like, and I hate to always use this example, but in 9/11, those financial firms were extremely diligent about business continuity and disaster recovery. They practiced it. They had fiber between locations. What they didn't anticipate was that some of their people would be unavailable, that some of their infrastructure would be crushed, and maybe in a couple of places. So you do have to think about the worst case scenario. You do have to plan. You do have to test. And you do need to think of it in these phases that we talked about.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that. I mean, it was always remarkable to me that 9/11, the recovery was as good as it was. Our Rob Strechay was telling me the other day that he was down in New York and they were carrying servers out. That was actually part of the resilience process. Yeah, that's not a product that you buy. That's a process that you have to implement, in a what if scenario. Okay, a few years ago, you might remember, Jon, the theme I think it was called RSA at the time. Of course, they changed the name now to RSAC, or they call it Conference. But I think it was RSA at the time. The theme was the industry has an identity crisis, kind of a fun play on words. But the point was there is no perimeter anymore where you can dig a moat for safety. Identity is the perimeter. So in 2026, we're going to hear a lot about identity and, of course, governance. And some of the key players to watch here, you mentioned SailPoint, Microsoft, Okta, Ping. Identity threat detection and response is obviously getting more and more attention, as you called out. What I want to explore with you is where identity is actually advancing versus kind of getting repackaged. And we're seeing a lot more AI in this layer, but identity access management has always been a domain where, it's like multiple stakeholders, as you point out, we're kind of showing here. So that makes things more cumbersome and harder to change. It's got to have, somewhat have a consensus. So what should CISOs focus on in 2026? Where do you see the biggest identity gaps right now? And what's a practical path to making identity initiatives, work inside of enterprises?
I'd say in the past, the CISO had a seat in the room when we talked about identity, and now they have a seat at the table, meaning they're being pulled into the development process, the IT operations process, and the business process to add security to identity. So there's some interesting things going on. AI is obviously a part of it, but things like identity governance. So who should have access to what? When I started in this business, what that meant was that security would come to the business owner, the line of business owner, and say, here are the people who have access to this system. Should they or shouldn't they? And it was just a checkbox. The line of business manager didn't have the time to go through one by one. So since then, we've talked about authorization and entitlements. AI can help here. AI can actually look at who is accessing this. Does it align with the role that they have? Have they moved to a different role where they shouldn't have access to this? This is a perfect application for agents. So that's one area of identity. The other thing is, why the heck are we still using passwords in 2026? We've been having this debate forever. Now, there are some new technologies that are helpful here. So things like the FIDO2 specification, things like passkeys, and now we see companies mandating this. We see consumerization of things like passkeys. So there's almost a consumerization of identity where this will come in through the back door where consumers say, wait a minute, I have passkeys when I want to do my banking online. Why don't we have them internally? And then the other area I'm real interested in is identity threat detection and response. Kind of harkens back to UEBA, user and entity behavior analysis. So now it's somewhere around 70% of attacks now are identity focused, meaning stealing passwords or finding the passwords on the dark web and using them versus coming in through some type of software vulnerability. So we have to do better training of our people, but we have to know the behavior that is appropriate in the context of what they do on a daily basis. So we're getting better at that, and identity threat detection and response will do that. And I've written about this, and I've also had some guests on my podcast, human risk management. So instead of training everyone in the organization the same way, we can use AI to say, Dave does a really good job with security, but Jon keeps clicking on those phishing links. So, and oh, by the way, Jon likes to watch videos to learn. Dave likes to read when he learns. So we can customize the training, and nudge is the term that they use, on demand. So when I do something wrong, I'm immediately taught what I did wrong and given some type of educational tool that fits the way I learn. So I'm very excited about that, and we'll see that a lot at RSA.
I'm glad you talked about getting rid of passwords. I remember Larry Ellison 2 years ago at Oracle Cloud World. It's now called Oracle AI World, but he said, we're going to get rid of passwords. Safra knows me when she sees me. Why can't computers know that? So hopefully that day is coming soon. I want to take a detour from your top 5 for a moment and bring in some ETR data. For the past several years, Eric Bradley at ETR and his team, they do a survey before RSAC, and this year's end response was 517. And the question we're showing here is, what percentage of your security tools currently leverage some form of AI? So very high level view, obviously, but a couple of things stand out. Only 5% of the respondents say they're not using any AI, which probably isn't true because AI is everywhere, as we'll talk about in a moment, one of your trends. And the data clearly shows that AI is steadily, albeit slowly, being injected into the security stack. We see here, for example, the percent of respondents that indicate more than 10%, that's up to 51% of the respondents, and that's an increase from 40% last year. 16% say AI is being used in more than half of their security tooling, up from 11%. So that's meaningful movement. And Jon, while there's activity, there's presumably caution.
Yeah, well, the first is you're right that there's more AI use than people think. We've been using machine learning in security tools for at least 10 years, and that's a form of AI, so it's there. Uh, the caution is legitimate, and as I said earlier, the security people, they're paid to be paranoid, they're paid to be cautious. Uh, so they are cautious of hallucinations. They're cautious of black box solutions. They're cautious of understanding, well, they want to understand what their vendors are doing, how they characterize their AI, how they build their models, who's building their models. All that's important. But at the same time, Dave, I think we do have to be open-minded because this is coming on fast and furiously. And so cautiously optimistic, as I said in my article, absolutely we need to be that way.
All right, let's come back to your top 5 trends. One of them was everything AI and future-proofing security operations. So if we zoom out to this biggest topic, of course, is AI. It just came off of NVIDIA GTC and had a massive Kool-Aid injection, but very enthusiastic and visionary. But AI is everywhere and security is no exception. This is where the conversation gets confusing though, because there are so many categories and subcategories and even more hype within each. So there are really 2 vectors that I want to discuss. The first is the defender track, how CISOs can secure the development and use of AI. Obviously MCP security is a hot topic, A to A, you got AI and firewalls, authentication, provenance, posture management, SecOps, literally every part of the security stack is getting AI-ified. And we always say security can't be a bolt-on, but do we risk AI becoming a bolt-on? And then the second vector is of course the attacker track. So RSAC is going to be full of scary threat narratives, from sophisticated polymorphic agent attacks to just way more clever and less obvious phishing that Dave and Jon won't click on that link. But help us separate the signal from the noise here. Jon, what are the AI security categories that should get real budget in 2026? What's noise? What should CISOs be doing right now, especially on a skills basis, something you really highlighted in your piece? Like, how does this change the type of individuals that we need, and how do their roles change?
Yeah, this is a big area, Dave. And I just filmed my latest version of my podcast with the CISO, and I asked him this very question because you know that the business managers, the executives, are just gaga over AI. How can it drive revenue? How can it lower costs? What is my competition doing? I need to pay attention to that. And all that's legitimate, but the CISO's job is to say, yes, we can do that, but let's do that intelligently. Let's manage our risk. Now, that's a dance that they have to play. Executives hopefully understand that. So we have to establish the right governance and make it universally true across the enterprise so that within reason, but every business unit is doing the same type of things. They have to make the case for AI. They have to develop AI applications in a responsible way. They have to use the right data. They can't be biased in the way they do things. So all of those things have to go in just as a framework for governance up top. Then we have to understand, well, what data are we using and who's using it? And so we have to identify that. So for instance, there's this whole notion of shadow AI, like who's using AI and are they exposing our data to it? So we need that visibility. And then after that, you need the tools to be able to manage this correctly. So we need to understand and add AI to our development cycle so that we're doing the right things in DevSecOps, for example. We need to understand things like liveness. So if somebody's logging in using biometric, is that a real person? That's a different topic, but that's an AI security tool. AI firewalling, so understanding where we need to enforce rules with the use of AI or the development of AI applications. So it's big, and it's really important for the CISO to get their hands on it because this attack surface is growing quickly. We're doing these things in co-development with our partners and our vendors. So there's a lot there, Dave, way more than we could talk about in this short video.
Well, we can pick it up at the event this week.
We sure can.
You're going to be there. I know you got tons of meetings, but hopefully we can spend some time on theCUBE as well. We've saved some inventory for folks like you. I want to bring in a topic that we've covered now for a few years, and you were one of the first people actually I talked about this, tracking this in the ETR data, and that's around tools consolidation. The question we're asking here is the degree to which practitioners say they're able to reduce the number of vendors in their security stack. And this graphic shows that there's some progress to this, what Nikesh, I think, at Palo Alto, Nikesh Arora, the CEO, coined the term platformization. I don't know if he coined it, but he certainly uses it extensively, and others have picked up on it. I've heard Jeetu Patel use it. He's also coming on, by the way. So not so much in terms of the percent of respondents that say they actually have decreased the number of vendors in their stack. That's still low at around 10%, up from 9%. So, that's margin of error stuff over the past 2 years, but we're seeing a meaningful drop in the percentage of respondents that say they're increasing the number of vendors. That's dropped from 51% 2 years ago down to 35% today. So if you filter, by the way, if you filter on Fortune 1000 companies, of which there are 75 in that sample, that 500 plus sample, 16% say they're decreasing the number of vendors. So that's a significantly higher figure than the average. So the number, jumps up a bit there. What do you think, John? I remember when I first showed this data to you, you were like, yeah, no kidding, Dave. We practitioners that I talk to, they're really, they can't reduce because they've got holes in their security portfolio that they have to fill, and only some new startup or some specialist can do that. But what do you think? Is Nikesh finally seeing his wish at least come true? Is there light at the end of that tunnel?
There's a lot going on here. So first of all, as a CISO, my job is to rationalize the cybersecurity platform all the time. So I've probably got an architect or an engineer or both, and that's part of their job is what are our new requirements? How are requirements changing? And are there things that, based on these new requirements, we can get rid of? So for instance, maybe a tool that we've used for years that we like is now assuming some of the functionality of another tool. I mean, this is something we've seen in the industry for years. Microsoft Windows is the classic example. At one point, it didn't have a TCP/IP stack, and it didn't have a browser, and of course now it does. So that's a good thing. That's rationalization is good for efficiency. It can be good for efficacy. At the same time, I'm a little cautious with that data because it's not uncommon for large organizations to do things like rationalize their endpoint security vendors or rationalize their firewalls, meaning I've got a large distributed enterprise. I've got some Palo Alto over here. I've got some Checkpoint over there. I've got some Fortinet over there. Maybe I should choose one vendor and buy everything from them. And so that would be reducing your vendors, but it's not so much platformization. I hold the same belief that I've had for years, and that platforms are a very good thing for SMB, so small, medium-sized business, small enterprises with resource constraints. So think of like state and local government are a perfect example. But when you get into the biggest enterprises, they're doing development over here. They're exploring new tools like cloud security posture management, or we talked about identity threat detection response over here. So there'll be a little bit of a push-pull. Now, I think more dollars will go to fewer vendors, but there also are always going to be niche applications where innovators come in. Typically, the big guys will buy them over time and integrate them, but that's a slower process. So it's a little bit of both.
I want to put a finer point on that because you're bringing out a nuance, which there's a difference between consolidating vendors and platformizations. Explain that difference, please.
Yes. Yeah, as I mentioned, if I have, and I'll use a different example, if I've got some CrowdStrike, some SentinelOne, some Trend Micro, and some legacy Symantec or McAfee, And I'm a new CISO. I say, well, why are we doing this? I want to have one vendor. I want one throat to choke. That's the old customer service saying. And maybe I get better pricing, but I definitely get more scale on my skill set because now all of my desktop support people have one system to look at. So that's consolidation of vendors. Platformization is that I start buying different tools, diverse tools from a single vendor who has customized the integration of those tools. So think of, I get threat intelligence, I get EDR, I get SIM, I get SOAR. This is alphabet soup, but I get threat intelligence. I get all that stuff from one vendor, and I kind of standardize on that vendor in my SOC. That's platformization, and we're seeing a lot of that. Like I say, it's a great advance for some customers. The largest customers, maybe not as good a fit.
So the former is reducing the number of vendors. The latter is actually a more integrated platform, just using the word to define the term. But are there other things that you can do with the platform for developers, other integration to other toolings? I mean, I think a platform, I think it's something that can evolve versus a set of sort of point products. Does that apply in security, and are there other benefits for those who are candidates for platformization?
Sure. So for instance, all of the platform vendors have their series of partners. So they've done custom integration. And so that extends the value of the platform. You're right, they may have development tooling and developer support services that help them. They may have professional services that are really customized to working on their platform, or they may have service providers who you can outsource that platform to. So absolutely, there's value there, but the more diverse your environment is, the more customized it is, the different threats that you face, maybe on a global basis, then it's really hard for a platform vendor to just catch up with all of those considerations.
And I think about the different approaches. You take like a CrowdStrike, I think George Kurtz would say we are a platform vendor, but they partner with, say, an Okta for identity, or Zscaler for cloud security, or SASE, whatever it is. And together, those integrations that they do constitute a platform. You may agree or disagree with that, but then there's Palo Alto, which says, okay, we're going to buy CyberArk. We're going to integrate that in. They're definitely an engineering product focused company, so I trust that they'll do the integration, but that's a different philosophy to get to so-called platformization. And then there are other companies that are, I don't know what Google plans to do with Wiz, but take Wiz and posture management as kind of more of a point tool. They would probably hate that because it's kind of a pejorative, but nonetheless, you wouldn't consider it a comprehensive platform. Thoughts on that? Is that a viable sort of mental model to think about it? Is Palo Alto more than just kind of cobbling together and becoming the sort of Cisco of security, if you will? Not with respect to G2 Patel, who's actually doing the integration, but sort of the previous Cisco. I think you follow the logic here. What kind of insights can you share in that sort of spectrum?
At the end of the day, I think a platform has to be tightly integrated. So you can extend your platform through APIs or through custom integration or what have you, and you can make it work pretty well, but does it work to the optimal way that you want it? Maybe, maybe not. So those who integrate, who go out and acquire these companies will say, well, we can do it better if it's native, if we have the proprietary access to the code and we can integrate it into our code base. And I think all the platform vendors face that. They're all acquisitive, but it's strategic to them. So we talked about identity, and people talk about identity as the new perimeter. It's not so new, in my view. Yeah. But you do see Palo Alto making an acquisition there, CrowdStrike making an acquisition there, which suggests to me that it's very strategic to them, and the platform is only as good as the elements of it, and identity is a really important element.
All right, so I'm going to give you the last word, and to set you up, you can take your views. You're seeing theCUBE, we ask like 30 questions in one, and you can pick your favorite, and then ultimately we put a mosaic together and the audience can get the full picture. But I want to set you up by giving you a nod to your other contenders that received, let's call it honorable mention, because there's so much going on in the industry generally and RSAC specifically. So you had Zero Trust Cloud Security, obviously still a thing, cybersecurity platforms. We already talked about the P word, DR, CDR, EDR, XDR, all the Rs, IT and OT security. We heard a lot about that at MWC a few weeks ago in Barcelona. Post-quantum cryptography, that's starting to hit the radar. You said some should worry about it, some shouldn't just yet. Maybe not this year, maybe next, we'll see. And then the power of community. Going back to the theme, not hype in many ways, that's what these events are all about, but getting together, the lobby con, the hallway con, these impromptu meetups are super valuable at these conferences. Give us your final thoughts, Jon, please.
Well, as you said, there's just so much going on that I did make that honorable mention column or list of honorable mentions. I guess the one I'll comment on is Zero Trust, because Zero Trust initiatives are ongoing. They may, like the term Zero Trust may not be as sexy as it was a few years ago, but it's still there. The Department of Defense has something like 156 different, not requirements, but different categories or different descriptions of what makes up Zero Trust. All the CISOs I talk to are in the midst of some type of Zero Trust initiative. Zero Trust cascades into things like identity, into things like resilience, into other areas of the stack. And so very, very important, ongoing. And like I say, it won't be that highlight on the marquee at RSA, but you can be sure that everyone will be talking about it.
Right, we're looking forward to seeing you there, Jon. That's it from here. Jon and I and Christoph and the entire CUBE team are going to be at RSAC all week. We broadcast from Media Row in Moscone West from Monday through Thursday. So definitely stop by and say hello. We're on the ground floor. As I say, we're running our CEO series again. And we've had some big names on the program over the years. We got George Kurtz, Nikesh Arora, Jay Chaudhry, Bipul Sinha's coming on, Anand Iswaran, Jitu Patel, Sumit Dewan, Nick Schneider, many, many more guests. It's going to be great. Jon, look forward to seeing you there. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, Dave. Pleasure, and I'll see you there.
And thank you for watching. We'll see you next week in San Francisco.